Greetings once again. Thank you for joining us. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Uh, as you know, we like the Peloton view, and you'll be seeing a large number of bikes going by soon. So we look forward to you're getting some of that exposure, perhaps without the noise. So we focus today on the fact that um, there were many comments made by Bob Lutz over time that reflected the logic that was being rolled out by the large OEMs like GM, Ford, and the large Europeans, be it BMW, Mercedes, and VW. And so the thrust of our conversation today is about the fact that it was predicted that Tesla would be doomed with its exposure to the ownership of battery factories. So we not only focused on the whole battery discussion, but other ways in which the logic of the structure of firms has been rethought to show that Tesla actually is the best model one could use when designing and building out electric vehicles. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a repeat visitor, welcome back. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the show, would like more investing and trading information, please join us on Patreon. So, as you may recall, one of the things that Bob Lutz pointed out, and here comes the Peloton, was that there is there's a problem out there, and the problem is that the process that automakers like a GM, for example, would use is that they only build about 25% of the vehicle. The rest they actually order from OEMs. This is a smart move because their capital deployment is better. Plus, when they buy parts, it allows them to put the R&D on the supplier rather than them having to do it. Now, this process is one of the reasons why GM and others won versus Ford over time. Basically, there are 2,000 parts in an ICE engine, and what ends up happening was that as Ford remained vertically integrated, it got crushed by the weight of the forward development of new products throughout the whole vehicle that they could no longer stay on top of, and therefore gave it up to the GM model, which is outsourcing in large amounts. So kind of the theory was this would happen to Tesla as well, and as you've seen, it has not occurred. So the first of the examples that I wanted to review today, as you know, is the fact that Bob Lutz had indicated that don't worry about it, Tesla would be out of business in the near term. And the primary reason for that is that the battery factories that Tesla was building in multiple locations would end up being an anvil around the neck of the company. And that's because what would happen is that there'd be abundant supplies of batteries, and then the value proposition that went with this process of building factories for battery would become a nightmare to the company, cost, employee-wise, etc. So, as you've seen, this has not been the case. And in fact, what's happening is GM and Ford have now started building their own factories. As you know why that is. Number one, the problem was that yes, LG could build, but the challenge is that once Tesla decided to build its own factories in tandem with Panasonic, it facilitated its ability to actually deliver a value in terms of cost of goods sold. So basically, if you build your own batteries, your costs at the end of the day are lower than competitors. If you're buying those batteries from out of house, and the battery is perhaps 50% of the cost of the vehicle, you actually have a disaster on your hand because you have to rely on that outside entity, and the margin that entity gets on that battery ends up being a margin that makes that entity no longer competitive for price. So I thought this was really interesting because when you listen to Bob Lutz originally, the logic of the fact that they're just buying the batteries they needed and they could leave all the capital costs on the suppliers seemed to kind of make sense based on the business model that that had been enforced by the major auto companies over the last 100 years. So I wanted to somewhat expand. So this is a well-known, and we've covered this idea relative to Bob Lutz. I wanted to expand this idea in other ways. So two more ways in which there's an expansion of this is, if you think about it, right now there's actually still a chip shortage that's going on when it comes to the OEMs. I just ran into a lady slash family that purchased a brand new electric Cadillac, and the chip that goes to the self-driving advanced stuff was not available, so they took the vehicle without it, and it'll be installed once it's available. But they articulated that they really missed the opportunity to be exposed to that technology, and it's an eventual to happen. The point here is that, guess what? It's one thing to buy the chip that would go into your full self-driving. Tesla's actually designing and having manufactured their chips, and the process by which they do their chips facilitates their ability to actually, reprogram sort of non-Tesla originally ordered chips to work in different capacities within the vehicle, and therefore allowing them to win and make vehicles while everybody else was experiencing the shortages that we've seen. So I thought this was very interesting because there's a question that sort of hangs over Tesla and has for a long time, which is, Elon, how can you give away 75% of the patents that Tesla has on its developed technology and still stay ahead of competitors? And over time, there are these little elements that are being revealed that sort of define how and why Tesla remains successful and remains dominant in terms of market share in the space. I wanted to introduce a new sort of realm of this party. So what happened is that I got a note from one of our viewers, his name is Dan, and he sent me a video from TikTok that showed a Ford executive discussing the challenges of buying parts in software-driven parts sort of in the new era. So what basically is happening at Ford is they pointed out that there are 157 subsystems that go into their vehicle. I believe this is their electric vehicles. And the problem they're having is that there's a process that you go to of getting bids from outsiders, and then each of those entities, once they won the bid, would build and provide that part for the vehicle, much like they do with ICE vehicles. The problem, though, is that all these different subsystems have software that controls, and the companies that have manufactured those components retain right to that software. So there's a whole bunch of issues with changes and integration with other things that pop up when you have this experience. Well, guess what? Because Tesla does its own programming and delivers that programming to its vehicles, they don't have to worry about this patent issue or how getting these separate components that have been programmed separately to work together properly, which introduces another reason why the Tesla model of vertical integration is going to be more heavily used by competitors because of this challenge. So what this means then is that there's a good reason why a lot of competing OEMs must or will now start becoming software companies. And as you know, one of the challenges with software or being a software company is 60% of the budget goes into building the software, and 40% of that budget goes into debugging that software. So now you have non-software companies being managed, or software companies being managed by non-software managers originally in the auto industry. So basically, as you can see, what's happening is the business model of Tesla is systematically becoming the business model of a bunch of other OEMs, and they have no choice. And until they can build and debug their software, it puts them in a slow catch-up mode when it comes to Tesla. So I thought this was very interesting because, um, there was or has been a lurking question about whether Tesla would be usurped by competitors simply because um, there are just too many things that they have to stay on top of in terms of R&D in order to keep the whole party going. And it turns out that when you have 2,000 parts, it's very hard to do the R&D maintenance process. When you have 17 parts inside the vehicle, as does Tesla, no problema. So the answer that's popping up then is that the management process has become a tougher task for competitors because the ease with which they can keep up with Tesla has completely disappeared, and therefore they're now stuck in this mode where do they have enough chips, therefore to go to the vehicles? The answer is no. We already reviewed the fact that the whole chip process has gone awry because um, they're trying to get volumes of chips when there are other people like Apple and a lot of other tech companies ahead of them in line, especially because they got out of the line, as we know, 2 years ago. So we're now in an interesting mode. Um, you know, as you know, Mary Barra pointed out that they were spending $30 billion to catch up with Tesla and exceed Tesla by 2025. But what we're finding is there's a whole bunch of reasons why that is not occurring and is likely to expand as a problem. Um, I, uh, obviously, um, they're going to keep trying. Obviously, there's a need to do so, but the turnaround time for them to be competitive with Tesla, not only sort of producing a car, but also having something out there that's efficient, works well, isn't missing parts, etc. Um, that's still out there. And so we have this off to the side thing going on right now, which is the theory had been that Tesla, or we would see growth in EVs at a certain pace, driven by market uh, demand expanding for a number of reasons. Somewhat the opposite has occurred. We're having demand issues because there are a lot of competitors that really don't have good solutions, uh, that don't offer, you know, easy to access charging, etc., to drive the expansion of the field. And consumers are kind of nervous about, well, um, are you ready to provide something that when I spend my 100 grand, I can get a charge, I don't have any charging issues, I have decent range, etc. And that's being offered across the board, and you don't have some of the software issues that I just described. So I just think this is another feather in the cap of Tesla, and it really shows that the logic being used by Bob Lutz and others across all OEMs has not worked out. And the reason for that is better technology and technologists at Tesla, and the strategic thinking relative to the first principles of physics that Elon talks about a lot is excellent from Tesla, and therefore we're seeing it retain its market share despite the entry of some very well-heeled competitors. So look forward to Tesla doing well and doing better based on this competitive advantage. So the final thing we wanted to cover today is I actually ran into a dermatologist, and her recommendation was even if you're not going outside, it's a good idea to use sunscreen because you also have the lights that you're walking under, as well as the light from your screen impacting you as you do work on a computer. So I thought that was kind of interesting, to maintain skin health and lack of cancer issues via this process. Anyway, once again, I want to thank you for joining us. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. And not only is Tesla not going out of business because they own battery factories, but competitors are going out of business because they don't own battery factories or will go out of business. Anyway, thanks once again for joining us. Tschüss, au revoir, lahitra road, hoda hafez, strasiche, ni hao ma, kumbawa. And in Jamaica, we say enough respect, walk good. Namaste.